Hi, I'm Dan Cortopassi. Welcome to the SP Consist build. In this series, I'm working to produce HO scale models of 5 locomotives I saw on the front of a Southern Pacific freight train in Truckee, California in 1993. In the last episode, I finished my HO scale model of Conrail SD40, number 6283. It's time to move on to the next model, Cotton Belt B30-7, a General Electric B30-7 locomotive. I'm basing this model on an HO scale Atlas B30-7. I photographed this locomotive in the summer of 1993. Doing a little research shows that it was repainted into SP's speed lettering scheme not long after my photo was taken. My intention is to model it as it appears in my photo. I started working on this engine early in the series when I was trying to build all the models in the consist at once. For my own sanity, I switched to working on one engine at a time, focusing on the Conrail unit. As such, I haven't touched this project in quite some time. My goals for this time are to evaluate the project to figure out where I was when I put this engine aside, finish most of the pre-paint detailing on the body of the locomotive, and do all the major surgery on the cab. It's been a while since I worked on this engine, so in a way it's like a new project. Just as if I were doing a new project, the basic process is to compare the existing model to photos and see what, if anything, needs to be changed. So let's take a look at the engine as it is now. I've already stripped the paint from the body, sill, and cab. Most of the work that I've done in this engine so far is on the rear of the long hood. I installed freestanding grab irons and new number board castings. I fabricated the mount for the oscillating lights, which was still there in 1993, even though the lights themselves have been removed. The radiator screen assembly on my model was broken. I glued it back together, but since then I found a replacement on eBay. The new screen assembly is supposedly for an Atlas B23-7, but it's the same size, and if there's a difference I can't see it. Since the plastic is so thin and likely prone to breaking again, I want to use the new screen assembly on the model. I'm going to set this part aside for now. I'll glue it on after the model is painted. I also removed the molded-on cab headlight, but the cab will need some additional work. I'll need to install a plate over the light location. Though the Atlas cab is mostly correct, SP's B30-7s were built with L-shaped engineer's front windows. Over time, these were replaced with 2 panes of glass with a post between. I'll need to widen the window over the short hood on the engineer's side and raise the window on the side so that the top is level with the middle windows. Some time ago I purchased a high-tech Details GE cab kit with the SP L-shaped window, which would be great if I were going to model the locomotive as built. I would have to add the post though, which would be difficult. The high-tech cab also has solid number boards which would need to be opened up to light them. Since the stock cab doesn't need to be assembled, has lightable number boards, and fits perfectly with the rest of the model, I decided to just keep it and modify the windows. Eventually I'll also need to fabricate a mount for the beacon. Looking at photos, the sill appears to be mostly correct. There are some louvers on the battery boxes on the engineer's side that aren't present on the model. I can use some Archer decals for those. I'll be tackling these things over the next couple of episodes. It doesn't look like there's too much left to do on the long hood. I compared the shell to photos and it looks like all the hood doors and grills are in the right places for the most part. The only discrepancy I can see is that the hood doors just behind the cab on both sides should be about half a scale foot toward the rear from where they are in the model. I've decided to leave them alone on my engine since it's not that noticeable and I'm not sure it's worth the effort. Moving them would require some major surgery and possibly a donor shell, which I don't have. There is one hole that needs to be filled where the factory horn casting was mounted. I've inserted some scrap styrene. I'll secure it with some liquid styrene cement. Same stuff from Micromark as the glue that I usually use for styrene to styrene joints. After it's dried, I'll shave off the excess with a number 17 chisel blade in my hobby knife. Then I'll apply some Squadron gray putty. When the putty is dry, I'll sand it with some 400 grit paper followed by 600 grit. Now that the hole is filled, I can turn my attention to the front of the body shell. The short hood needs class light covers. There are also holes for a small grab iron that wasn't present on the prototype unit. I'll need to fill those. Squadron gray putty can be used to fill the holes. I'll spread it with a screwdriver blade and leave it to dry overnight. Now I'll sand the excess putty, starting with 320 grit sandpaper. I'm being careful not to touch the headlight or the small round detail near the bottom. I'm also going slow and being careful not to sand any grooves into the plastic. After all the work I did on the rear of this part, I don't want to ruin the front. I'll shave off the bolt details for the grab iron, again using a number 17 chisel blade. It probably would have been better to do this first. This is why you shouldn't start a work session when you're tired. I'll follow up with some 400 grit, then 600. That should be fine enough to keep any scratches from showing through the paint. After filling things with putty, I like to put on a little paint as a test. The color doesn't really matter. When the paint dries, it should show if I need to put more putty in the holes. Even though I used railroad tie brown, which should have a flat finish, it dried with a slight sheen. That's actually good though, as I can hold the model up to the light to check my work. I can't see any evidence of the grab iron holes, which is what I want. If I could still see the holes, I'd have to apply more putty and repeat the process. I'll sand again with 400 followed by 600 grit paper to remove the test paint. Now the grab iron is gone and I can move on to the next step. This is a set of GE class light covers from KV Models. The covers in the top row with 3 dots on them match my photos of 7787. I'll cut them out using the back of my X-Acto knife blade on a plate glass cutting surface. Then I'll carefully clean up the edges with a file. After carefully positioning the covers, I'll glue them using liquid styrene cement. Photos show that the dots on the covers should form a triangle pointing up, and that the 2 dots that form the base should be even with the bottom of the headlight housing. The last thing for now is to drill out the walkway lights with a number 76 bit. I think it would look cool to make these work using fiber optics, which will eventually be installed through the hole. On the cab, I'll start with the windows. Using a small straight edge, actually an N-scale trip pin height gauge, I'll draw some guidelines on the cab with a pencil. Now I can carefully enlarge the windows. I'll start with the number 54 drill bit since it looks to be about the same radius as the existing window corners. I'm drilling along the guidelines. After drilling the holes, I'll very carefully remove the plastic between the holes, shaving little bits at a time with a sharp hobby knife. I'll follow up with files. This looks pretty close to my photos. I'll use one of the light covers from BLMA set 4551 to cover the upper headlight location. KV Models has similar covers available. I've found that liquid styrene cement works well for bonding small brass parts like this to plastic. Since there are holes for headlight lenses, I'll reinforce the bond with some CA applied from inside the cab. I'll drill a new hole for the engineer's side windshield wiper using a number 76 bit. Sprue cutters will get rid of the light pipes from the factory number board insert. I don't want these to push through and detach the headlight cover. This part still has the factory number on it. I'll use some 400 grit paper to remove them, followed by 600 grit. Even though it'll be a while before I'm ready for decals, I'll brush some microgloss on the number boards. I'll set this part aside. Now I can turn my attention to the roof. Cotton Belt's B30-7s had roof-mounted air conditioners and a boxy structure that appears to be an antenna support. I'll be using Detail Associates Part 2308, a prime air conditioner. This is a set of photo-etched brass antenna stands from Details West. The square one looks to be about the right size for the antenna box on this model. It took some research, but looking at photos it appears that the flat-bottomed air conditioner was actually recessed into a cutout in the rounded roof on these units. I'll need to plan my next steps carefully. I'll start by positioning the air conditioner and the square antenna stand on the roof. When I don't have actual drawings or dimensions, I tend to assume that people favor even measurements. It looks like if I start the cut a scale 6 inches back from the cab front and end at 4 scale feet from the cab front, it should be about right. I've marked the locations with a pencil. It looks like the edges of the flat area should be about even with the bumps near the ends of the number boards. This is about 2 3/4 scale feet from the center. I've drawn cut lines with a pencil. I'll do one last check to make sure that the air conditioner in my antenna box will fit. Now I can start opening up the roof. Rather than risk butchering the part, I'm going to start by drilling a series of small holes around the outside of the area to be removed. Next, I'll use my sprue cutters to snip through the plastic between the holes. I'll use a combination of flat files and a hobby knife to finish off the hole. Then I can give the roof a light sanding with some 400 grit paper to remove the pencil marks. A quick test shows that the AC unit will just fit front to back exactly as it should. Now I need to fill the opening in the roof. I'll score and snap a piece of 40 thousandths styrene 3.5 scale feet wide. Then I'll cut it to match the width of the opening. The piece is very slightly oversized, so I'll need to sand it down a little until it fits. It took some trial and error, but I got it to fit with minimal gap. I'll use another file to press it down to make sure that the edges are flush with the roof. The stock cab roof is thick enough that there won't be any filler needed on the inside. I'll glue the part from the inside with some liquid styrene cement. To fill the seams on the sides, I'll use a little squadron gray putty. I'll set the cab aside to dry overnight. I often use a scrap piece of sheet styrene as a makeshift sanding block. I'll lightly sand the excess putty, taking care not to deform the rounded shape of the roof. Time for some more test paint. After the paint dries, I can look at the model from multiple angles to see if the seam is still visible. I don't see anything, so this is good. I'll sand off the paint. Now I can test fit the air conditioner. Everything looks good so far. In the photo, it appears that the AC unit is resting on some kind of bracket. It's not clear to me if the brackets are just in the front and the back of the unit or if it's a part that extends under the entire thing. It looks like my AC unit detail part doesn't stick up as far as the one in the photo, so I'm going to opt to put a bracket under the entire thing to raise it up slightly. I'm going to start with some 10 by 20 thousandths strip styrene. I've cut two pieces the same width as the flat spot on the roof. Using a very small amount of liquid styrene cement, I glued one strip at the front of the flat spot and one in back. I've cut a piece of 10 thousandths styrene sheet to fill the area under the AC unit. It's a little hard to see, but this is the completed AC mount. With the extra thickness, the height of the part looks better to me. I'm going to hold off gluing the AC unit in place until after painting. For the antenna box, I've rough cut a square of 80 thousandths styrene and glued it to the brass antenna plate. I use the brass as a guide while sanding the styrene. I'll start with files, followed by one of my makeshift sanding blocks. I'll finish with some 400 and 600 grit paper on plate glass. This is the box after sanding. The next step is to make it seat properly on the curved roof. This Atlas B23-7 model has the same cab as the B30-7, and this one's roof doesn't have the AC notch yet. I've put some 320 grit paper on the B23-7's roof. Now I'll sand the roof contour into the bottom of the antenna box by carefully dragging it over the center of the roof. After checking the fit, I'll glue the antenna box to the roof with liquid styrene cement. Though all the dimensions for this part are guesstimated, it looks right. It's square, it fills the space behind the AC unit, and it's just slightly taller than the AC unit. While I was at it, I went ahead and made a second antenna box for the B23-7. Eventually, I'll want to detail the roof of this unit in the same way. All of the major surgery on the cab is now complete. There are just some small details left to install, which I'll tackle next time. The model is definitely starting to look more like a Cotton Belt B30-7. I imagine that I'm not alone in sometimes trying to do too many things at once and then having to set some of those things aside for a while. Sometimes diesel projects can linger unfinished for years. When coming back to a project, it's good to figure out how far along it is and what still remains to be done. It's also good to reevaluate to see if your goals have changed. For example, when I started this build, I wasn't installing ground lights in locomotives. Now I want to plan for that. When making the decision about the hood doors behind the cab, I considered how much of an overall effect moving them would have on the finished model. For me, the answer was not much. Some others might want to take that plunge. There's no right answer, but I think it's important to step back for a minute and think about the bigger picture before cutting into a model. Reworking the cab roof, on the other hand, is something that I thought was well worth it. We don't always get to see the roofs of real trains because they're so tall, but in model form, the top is one of the things we see most clearly. If you need to make duplicate parts, I find that sometimes it's more efficient to do them at the same time. I find that I tend to get faster, and indeed the second antenna box for the B23-7 took way less time than the first. Even though I'm not working on the B23-7 right now, it's more efficient than waiting until I get around to detailing that model. Now I'll have one less thing to do when I eventually do start working on that engine. I'm pretty happy with the progress that I've made on this locomotive so far. Next time I'll finish detailing the cab and move on to the sill. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Stay tuned and thanks for watching.